Hello dears, how's it going? Welcome to Spooky Month. I made my October videos out of order, so I did this whole little thing in the second video for this month about how both videos are going to be related to the overlap of disability and spooky topics. So anyway, I won't give you the spiel again, but that's what's happening. Today we're going to cover a topic I keep offhandedly mentioning in lots of my other videos and have yet to formally talk about in one place. So we're putting it in one spot. It's gonna be great. And that topic is how the horror genre is a modern extension of the freak show and how that entrenched a lot of stereotypes about disability in media. There's great stuff about horror too. This is not gonna be all horror bad, don't worry. We'll get to the good stuff at the end. Also for friends who need it, I'm a white young person with light brown curly hair that is currently in a messy ponytail. I'm wearing a black tank top and I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it. Now, in the very early days of film, around the early 1900s or so, filmmakers were still trying to figure out what kinds of things audiences might want to see and how film as a narrative medium could work. And that sort of led to two separate situations. First situation is this idea of what can we experiment with that will wow people and or look magical. A filmmaker and magician by the name of Georges Méliès was particularly good at this. He created what is thought to be the first thing we would maybe see today as like a horror film in 1896. It had a 3-minute runtime and its title has been translated to The Haunted Castle or The House of the Devil. It had all kinds of things we think of in horror today. The New York Film Academy describes that as cauldrons, animated skeletons, ghosts, transforming bats, and ultimately an incarnation of the devil. But this movie was intended to be more like wondrous and interesting and exciting rather than truly spooky and scary. Back to the situations as a result of film as a new medium. The second thing that it led to was a lot of adaptation. Because if you're not quite sure how to use a technology as a way to tell a story, you tell stories people already kind of know and already kind of like. And if you can only use very minimal dialogue because it's a silent film, they were never truly silent, of course. There was always associated music playing, but didn't have a lot of dialogue. You're going to pick things to adapt that have very strong and clear visual storytelling components because that makes life easier for everybody involved. To be clear, all kinds of fully original films were also being created at this time. This is much more a historically noteworthy pattern that leads us to the next thing rather than the rule. But this led to the adaptation of a lot of Gothic fiction, particularly Dracula, Frankenstein, The Picture of Dorian Gray, for example. Now, Gothic fiction as a literary genre is generally seen as what popularized the idea of suspense and keeping a reader on their toes. It also linked archaic places with the spooky and scary, as well as the use of the supernatural and of archetypal characters. It also tends to involve monsters, whether that be people behaving like monsters or actual literal monsters, and a lot of disability within that. And none of these things were super revolutionary in isolation, of course. We've had spooky stories with monsters in them for as long as we've been telling stories, but the genre popularized them combined as one unit. And that thing happened to be super conducive to film adaptation because of the strong imagery, clear archetypes, and already existent popularity of the source material. This was also a time where people didn't like show up for the time of the movie and watch the whole film. It was a time when people would kind of walk in and out of the theater at will. So having something that's suspenseful and exciting means people are going to want to stay for the entire length of the film, so that's also really helpful. We also see other films mimic the style for the same reasons, especially during the silent era, like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu, for example. We see these pop up a lot from like 1900 to 1920 or so. But why did Gothic fiction care so much about disability, you might be wondering? Also, if you're like me and you forget what years or what era, the Gothic fiction stuff appeared from like the 1760s to the 1840s or so, though things that fit into that category have obviously happened since then. And that era is one that is really important for disability, and we've talked about it before on this channel because this is the Industrial Revolution, where there's a massive increase in industrialization and capitalism as we know it today finds its roots. Disability has, of course, been around as long as living creatures have been around. They will always be members of the species that have physical and mental difference, but disability as the distinct social category we think of it today is because of this capitalist structure. It required separating out who could work efficiently and who could not work efficiently. We see seeds of this appear in the 1500s and 1600s, with the poor laws defining who was the deserving poor and the undeserving poor based on somebody's ability to work, but that was a time when significant amounts of what would later be classified as disability were left completely uncommented upon because of the nature of the work people were doing at the time. The rise of industrialization meant a focus on efficiency and comparison between bodies, which meant the category of who was unable to work became larger and more easily distinguishable. This is also the era where we see the beginning of the commercialized freak show and of institutions, asylums, specialized schooling, and involuntary hospitalization of disabled people as it becomes increasingly medicalized. Eugenics appears sort of after this era, but the beginnings of eugenic ideas definitely appear in this time as well. And so people in society are seeing this shift where disabled people are starting to, for lack of a better way to put it, disappear. They now become something you see almost exclusively at the freak show or wandering the grounds of that hospital uptown, rather than the friendly disabled person in town your whole community helps care for. That still happened, of of course, but the separation from society became a lot more common. All of which to say, there was a lot of attention to bodies and difference and anxiety around bodily difference that came up in this era, which bleeds into a lot of the art of this time. Beyond that, disability in general is also a really useful narrative tool and something that has been central to storytelling for literally forever. People have always had questions around why difference happens and what it might mean, and difference has always existed, so it's always been involved in the stories that we tell. But what's notable about the era of Gothic fiction specifically is that it's a really great historical example of expanding beyond why is difference into commentary around societal othering, because that was top of mind for these authors. And alienation and sympathizing with the alienated is a hallmark of post-industrial revolution storytelling in general, where disability becomes a common way to clearly demonstrate the other to the reader. Even in cases where it's not disability as we think of disability and more in the supernatural monster category, the word monster was initially only historically used to refer to disability, and disability was believed to be caused by the supernatural, so there isn't really that much of a difference between those two things. So we have this increased human connection to the monstrous because everybody began to feel alienated and like they're part of a system, anxiety around conformity and difference because that decides how much you're able to survive and work under capitalism, and this normalization of only seeing monstrous people as separated and isolated from the general population, and thus only framed through a medical or a freak show lens for the average person. So even real-life disabled people became media, something voyeuristic that you look at from a safe distance rather than actually interacting with them. As freak shows became popular, institutionalization became more normalized, and ugly laws were put into effect that prevented visibly disabled people from appearing in public in the latter half of the 1800s. People really only saw disability at the circus or the freak show or the dime museum, or read about it in their novels, and some people would go to their local institutions to watch mentally disabled people put on theatrical performances, which became the inspiration for many artistic movements, particularly the post-World War I things like Dadaism, and I believe Expressionism as well. Horror is widely written about as having strong connections to German Expressionism, which is part of why it's so unrealistic and over the top. It doesn't always make sense at times. It's not lost to me that this is another piece of the disability puzzle for how intertwined disability and horror have been since the beginning. But what freak shows really profited off of was this innate human desire to experience things that are strange and confusing and maybe a little bit unsettling, specifically in this era where conformity was the #1 goal. And so there was some comfort to be found in, well, I may not fit in, but at least I'm closer to normal than those people are. And freak shows have been around to some extent pretty much as long as people have been around, but the kind that you're thinking of, the one that we associate with like P.T. Barnum, also marketed itself as educational. It is okay to come stare at these people because they're teaching you something scientific about humanity. You're also learning about critical thinking and asking questions, and you're engaging your sense of wonder, so it's good for you. Even as medicalization became more common, they were initially able to tie this in as a sort of like, come learn about this medical oddity. We're teaching you something, and use the doctoral reports about specific freaks as like a badge of legitimacy. But as medicalization became more common and eugenic rhetoric began to become more popular in the early 1900s, a lot of the curiosity about people that were different began to turn into pity and feeling bad for the freak show performers, leading to a decline in audience interest and thus overall decline in freak shows more generally. They went from something interesting and acceptable and educational to something lowbrow and inappropriate and exploitative. I won't go into my whole diatribe about how freak shows were neither good nor bad, and our insistence that they were all unethical and terrible only exists to distance ourselves from a history we're ashamed of while ignoring how we keep perpetuating it in different formats. I have a video about the history of freak shows and on how vaudeville was built off of them, and then early film was built off of vaudeville, and etc. I will link that above for you if you want to check that out. But as freak shows began to fall out of favor, many freak show performers disseminated into vaudeville. And then both industries began to fall out of favor when film hit the scene because film was cheaper to produce than live performance, and also some business choices were made by vaudeville that sort of undercut what was appealing about vaudeville. But for the sake of narrative here, we're going to focus on the first thing. Early film, particularly films that included monsters and visible disability, ended up sort of absorbing a lot of what had initially made freak shows appealing to people. The ability to engage with something different and curious and interesting, but from a safe distance where you don't have to interact with it. And because the majority of the time it was makeup and prosthetics and effects in movies, people felt less guilty for staring and for feeling a certain way about things because of how it was packaged. This kind of voyeurism was socially acceptable, and it was easier and felt better because there's less direct interaction with the people involved. What is known as the Golden Age of horror, or the era of classic horror, is generally from the 1920s to the 1930s and mostly from Universal, with the two primary horror directors being Todd Browning and James Whale. notably Tom Browning being a disabled man and James Whale being so incredibly gay his nickname was the Queen of Hollywood, both pieces of history that I think are incredibly important. Universal's era of success in the horror sphere really kicked off with their 1925 Phantom of the Opera starring Lon Chaney, who also was a child of deaf adults and has played many disabled icons, including the Phantom and Quasimodo and Hunchback. We talk about him a lot in this channel, he keeps coming up. Classic horror films also include the 1931 Frankenstein, the 1931 Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and the 1932 The Mummy starring Zita Johann, who is the original young woman in Machinal, which we analyzed last month. Wow, everything connects. It's almost like there's only like 12 people in the theater and film industry. Anyway, the 1930s are also the first time we see the word horror used to describe this genre. Before that, it was just seen as dark romantic melodrama. This era cemented a lot of the aesthetics that we associate with horror, including the ones about disability, but we'll get back to that in a bit. The golden age of horror came to an end in the late 1930s due to a conglomeration of things, including a change of leadership at Universal, massive budget cuts, increased censorship in the United States that began being strictly enforced in July of 1934 with the Hays Code, and the British Board of Film Censors choosing to no longer accept American imports in 1936, which cut a good portion of revenue. And we can't talk about censorship and horror without talking about one of the most iconic disability films of all time, Todd Browning's 1932 Freaks. We've covered this film a lot of times before, most notably in my Sideshow analysis because the conjoined Hilton twins were in it, but this movie is widely seen as one of the shocking things that led to the creation of the production censorship code. It's a feature film about a little person working in a sideshow who falls in love with a non-disabled trapeze artist, and the rest of the disabled people accept her into their fold as one of them, but it turns out she's actually just trying to take advantage of her now husband and intends to kill him, so the rest of the freaks vow revenge and they go after her, turning her into a freak as punishment for what she did. We can have all the scholarly arguments about how the message of that is sort of unclear and maybe bad because on one hand it's like it's normalizing the freaks and we see them do things like laundry and playing board games and having babies, how great. Well, on the other hand, it's also framing infrequent and disfigurement as punishment for wrongdoing. But also Todd Brown was forced to cut 30 or more minutes from the original runtime because it was received so poorly, and because of that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And clearly there were more things it intended to include that are now just completely lost to time. But either way, audiences reacted really strongly to this film and it became banned media in a lot of places for a very long time. And those conversations around what kinds of things were allowed to be on screen, what was acceptable for an audience to view, became very loud around this movie and some others at the time, which led to the formal creation of a censorship advisory board and guidelines for films to follow. There was this widespread eugenic belief that lots of different things were contributing to the degeneration of the race and were thus not safe and should be regulated. This is where we get the ugly laws from. There was a view of unsightly individuals as threats to the health and equilibrium of normal Americans. Yikes. And art that is calm and clean and morally good was believed to improve the race, and everything else supposedly made it worse. An early film that was aggressively pro-eugenics, The Black Stork, was censored to be exclusively for medical audiences after its original screenings in 1917 because audiences were so upset by it and it was believed as being unhealthy for regular audiences to watch. A 1918 censorship guideline as a result of this movie stated that virtually all unpleasant aspects of medicine should be off of public screens, including distressing scenes, operations, overt eugenic themes, death, insane people, etc. And to be clear, this movie was upsetting because it was pro-infanticide of disabled infants. Anyway, there was, and I guess to some extent still is, an interesting dichotomy with the horror genre because theaters would market the film specifically by the fact that it will cause bodily distress, and that's what makes it exciting. Meanwhile, eugenic censors were super concerned about the fact that films were doing that and wanted to prevent it because they believed this debilitating impact, like freezing up in fear or feeling sick, was morally wrong and was poisoning the race. But once censorship became less of a, here are vague guidelines we think about, and more like this one guy controls every single script that comes out of Hollywood with the enforcement of the Hays Code starting in July of 1934, things became a lot stricter. The code imposed on horror film reception a framework in which certain films' damages to bodily and mental health were also viewed as injuries to the spiritual self. This led to a lot of coding in films because you were allowed to show, or if you couldn't show, aggressively imply, some moral depravity as long as the person was the bad guy, or otherwise karma got involved to punish their bad actions. So you can show somebody who has queer traits, but they kind of have to die. Somebody can also commit crimes, but they do need to end up in jail. Somebody can be visibly deformed, but they either need to die or be cured by the end of the film. Somebody can cheat on their partner, but they have to be punished for it. Couples simply must sleep in separate beds because the concept of sex just is not allowed. And you're not allowed to see pregnant women. At all. I read through the entire code in a video, I will link it above, but since minority people wanted to see people like them on the screen and knew that they were allowed to, as long as they were the villain, we got some really, really gay villains out of this time. Some great examples of queer coding being pretty much every Disney villain from your childhood films. They're like sassy and extra, they talk a certain way, maybe have iconic makeup and hyper fashionable outfits that are a little out there. Disney's brand in general, even to this day, more or less just is a repackaging of the Hays Code, but that's a conversation for another day. These rules also inevitably made everything in cinema a little bit formulaic because they had strict rules on narrative, which made it really easy for stereotypes to codify because we're seeing the same stories more or less repackaged in different kinds of films. Things like connecting so-called sexual deviance and deformity to villains wasn't inherently like anything particularly new. The original Dracula has some deeply queer subtext, and Quasimodo is about as disabled as a gothic character can be, but it becomes a lot more common under censorship. The Hays Code also led to a lot of film adaptations of well-known works looking like the original story was put through a blender. I highly recommend doing comparisons to different versions. It's always delightful and it brings me joy every time I have to analyze something from that era. Gatsby and Phantom in particular have made some fascinating choices over the years. But this is why early horror, when censorship was a conversation but not a rule, is seen as the golden age of classic horror, because after that it became a lot more difficult to make things actually scary while following all of the rules that were in place. But what makes horror particularly interesting as a genre to study is that in order to intentionally scare your audience, you have to know and play with what people find scary. One scholar specifically described it as creating a sinister, inverted image of the things we hold most dear. And those are things that change as the world changes, and change from culture to culture as well. When we look at early horror, we see a lot of fear around the super obvious, archetypal, often supernatural other who is often coded as the things that eugenics feared. People in lower classes, immigrants, people of color, disabled people, and queer people, though the last two are more coded and are a very consistent through line in all of horror history. But a huge focus of early horror is around the clear delineation of good and evil, and normalcy is usually restored by the end of it. But when we get into like post-war horror in the 1940s and 50s, we see a lot more films around invasion and radioactive mutation. In the 50s and 60s, Cold War tensions lead to a merging of sci-fi and horror as categories to create a specific subgenre. Also, Alfred Hitchcock's 1960s Psycho completely changed the game, where the villain is just like a random guy who you can't immediately tell is evil. And Hitchcock was also the first director to have conversations around spoilers and prevent late admittance to a film, which changed the formerly you show up and leave whenever you want movie theater atmosphere into more of a specific event, which changed how people consumed film going forward. The satanic panic of the 70s and 80s led to lots of movies dealing with the religious evil, like The Exorcist and The Shining. The 1980s was also slasher central, and in the 90s and early 2000s we start to see a lot more like torture-related content. The zombie content starts to appear again, but at this point it became kind of hard to innovate or do anything new because of how formulaic horror has been since the beginning, and also how many hyper-specific subgenres there are. Today, films tend to be less jump scare, ooh, how spooky, and more in the psychological horror arena, where we fear ideas and concepts rather than specific concrete things. Also, a lot of technology-related horror. There are still ways to reinvent the mold. Get Out comes up over and over again in the research as like a recent film that changed the game in the horror genre. It's just an increasingly difficult genre because so much of it has already been done to some extent and then remade again. So even if you're like inverting something that already existed, that inversion has probably been done at some point. But going back to disability as a storytelling tool, why is this the genre that most utilizes disability? Obviously there's the historical aspect, right? Because it's built on media that already utilized disability extensively, but even then, it used it for the same purpose. So then the question behind that question is, why is disability something we use to scare people? What makes disability scary? And the first thing is the illusion of control. Disability is the one minority group that you could join any second. Like, I hope you don't get hit by a bus tomorrow, but you could, and that could make you disabled for the rest of your life. And part of why people are so like judgy about fault and cause around disability is because they want to believe that they can avoid it if they try hard enough or if they're good enough people. The fact that our bodies are not invincible and that disability and death are inevitable things that are often out of our control is very reasonably quite scary to people. Disability is also something that tends to blur the binaries between a lot of things. Sickness and wellness, singular personhood and multiplicity in the case of like conjoined twins or dissociative identity disorder. Historically, it blurred the binary between human and animal. Thematically, that still exists today. It's just usually phrased a little bit differently because people now understand the concept as ableist, so they phrase it different, but the idea is still there. And there's also a subversion of expectation with disability, where if you've only ever been around and seen non-disabled people, there's inherent, oh, I wasn't expecting that. When you come upon somebody using a wheelchair or with a facial difference, or somebody who has one leg or uses ASL, for example. And horror movies know this, so they use it for shock value. It's not just that we're revealing who the big bad is, but they also look and or sound notably different from anybody else in this film and everyone else you've ever seen as a way to unsettle you even further. Horror films tend to in particular rely on facial difference because the face is the thing that you're going to see the most often on screen, and so it is more visibly noticeable than say like a prosthetic leg or something like that. And so films will often also play with the tension of, ooh, what are they hiding under that mask, until there's a narratively strong moment for an extra reveal. Every iteration of the Phantom of the Opera, including the musical, really utilizes this idea as an example. Specifically in the musical, we see Christine react to seeing his face, and then the audience gets to see his face and they react, and that builds up even further tension for that reveal. With the right lighting and camera angles, anyone could look terrifying. There is no reason to use people with real health conditions in a way that only makes life and society's understandings of them more difficult. But because historically physical difference was linked either with moral degeneracy or with the poor, tragic innocent, it became an easy narrative shortcut for film to use. And physical difference has been a shortcut for mental difference in theatrical performance since like forever. I think Richard III is a famous example of that. His hunched back is like what cues the audience that he is crooked and corrupt. So that connection was already well worn for audience members before it hit the screen. I feel like I keep telling you in this video things that like people attribute to early film and then remembering that they've existed forever just in a different font, which is sort of like undercutting the thesis of the idea that horror film entrenched a lot of these tropes. But stories are always recycling and combining and creating new versions of the exact same thing. But in this case, this new version of the same thing became more codified because of how widespread and universal it was. Everybody was going to see these films, and so these tropes entered cultural consciousness in a new way, and also the exact same films saved over various generations, right? And this shaped the rest of the horror genre as well as other kinds of film and performance that followed. Like modern horror theater is way more based on historical horror films than on what horror theater looked like before that, but I digress. So we have this issue of disclosing disability is a visual gut punch of shock value for our audience to make it spookier, and on top of this we have the fact that disability is really useful as a narrative tool, specifically coded as metaphor, which in and of itself is an issue because disabled people don't exist as a metaphor for something, we just kind of exist. And often in the academic field, scholars forget that disability as a minority group exists and sort of overlook any disability explanations of a story, talking exclusively about the other minority identity that they decide to say the disability is a metaphor for, which isn't inherently the hugest issue because when these films were choosing their alienated other character, often as the monster, it's not usually just disability coding that's going on. The monster has to align with the unnatural, and based on eugenicist points of view, the only natural people were like cishet, white, non-disabled, middle to upper class people, which means the degenerate other is often coded as gender nonconforming, queer, lower class. Poverty at the time was linked with primitivism and criminality. It was believed that poor people were poor because they were genetically inferior. Yeah, and then the racial coding is also very extensive due to that era's anxieties around immigration and the mixing of kinds. Dracula, for example, really clearly follows this fear of the Western European other literally tainting the blood of everybody else. Hyde from Jekyll and Hyde is usually visually coded as Jewish and or Western European, and this was a time when phrenology was around, the whole like if your head has wrong lumps and bumps, you're genetically inferior science. Science, we'll put that in air quotes. So any facial and cranial differences we see in monsters were an inherent cross-coding of disability and race. I more wish that academic analyses would choose to focus on all of the minority identities combined as one unit in the horror genre, rather than just go like, yeah, this visibly disabled character is a metaphor for race, and talk about eugenicist language around race, and then somehow just forget to mention disability altogether, because that's what much of the literature does. But moving on, there are kind of three different tropes that we can group most disability representation in horror into. It's really just two, like the villainous monster and the sweet innocent. The monstrosity category just like has a lot of subsections because we really like disabled villains. But anyway, the sweet innocent category, more or less self-explanatory. Usually the image that pops up in my brain for this trope is Tiny Tim, like the poor little helpless disabled child who's a narrative prop for the main characters to learn something from. And in the horror genre, this usually appears either as the poor sweet elderly person or disabled child who dies like right off the bat, or you're tragically rooting for them against the odds the entire time, knowing that the odds are against them and their eventual death is meant to create big feelings and tug at your heartstrings. Bonus points if it's also a child. Another version of this trope that has become more frequent in very recent media but has been around forever is that of sensory horror, where a character is blind and or deaf, and so the thing that is scary is that this person cannot see and or hear the monster, but you as an audience member can, so it builds up this suspense. But it also makes it seem like people who are blind and or deaf are incredibly helpless and in more danger than the average person, which is not the case. A crossover trope between the sweet innocent and the monstrous villain is the innocent, mentally disabled character who doesn't know any better and accidentally commits atrocities. This is sort of what they did to Frankenstein in the film adaptations. A non-horror example of this would be Of Mice and Men, which I need to do an analysis of at some point. We'll get there. To some extent, we also sort of see this appear in the Bat Boy musical as well. I don't consider that specific use of this trope to be a problem. That show actually does a really great job with disability. We'll talk about that next month. But that specific brand of trope is one that equates equates mental difference with criminality and this dehumanizing idea of the animalistic human who doesn't know any better and perhaps isn't capable of knowing any better. The idea of a disabled person as an animal-human hybrid also has extensive historical roots. That's not new. And in the mental disability category, there's also the trope of dissociative identity disorder that assumes that there's always one bad alter who wants to hurt people, and a somewhat similar one with schizophrenia where we see hallucinations and delusions encouraging torture and or murder, despite it being well documented that those with mental disabilities are no more likely to be violent than the general population, and might even be less so depending on the study that you read. We see the use of seizing and seizures to be creepy, usually ignoring that there are like a lot of different kinds of seizures. They only use the one. Jekyll and Hyde tends to use this one a lot. Jekyll and Hyde also links the use of drugs to becoming primitive and animalistic and mentally unwell, another eugenic idea played up in early adaptations of the work that has since stuck. And then there's the mutilated Avenger, the character who is displeased about having been disabled or having been created at all, and thus goes after either the person who made that happen or just all of humanity to try to avenge that loss. Captain Ahab from Moby Dick is a textbook definition of this. That's not horror, but you know what I mean. There's also the when they turn evil, they become disabled thing that Star Wars likes to utilize all of the time, and the historical idea of beautiful equals good and ugly equals bad, and so when good person become bad, they must become disfigured. That's very, very pervasive. And then there's also the Mad Doctor, who in creating monstrosity becomes monstrous themselves. This one is a particularly interesting phenomenon in horror because whenever it's used, it tends to like play up the voyeurism aspect of it, where it's showing you that the doctor views their patient the way that they view like a theater show. But then it also falls into this pathological and cure-oriented framework itself, where an audience gets to look at the disabled character through this inherently medical lens. They are to some degree given permission to pathologize and stare at the character more than they would for the average villain because of this framing. But the Mad Doctor is also inherently interesting because we see how even historically there was this understanding that doctors wield a lot of power and control and maybe aren't always the most competent and or to be entirely trusted. Very early films in the genre usually have this doctor come in and save the day, but they very quickly change to start becoming the source of the evil themselves. But this topic also brought up the question to me as like, why are asylums spooky? Why do people find something inherently scary about nurses and doctors? Is it that they have control over bodies? Is it that they're a reminder of how fallible our bodies really are? And I think the service level answer for asylums, right, is that we know that there are places where people have been tortured and mistreated, where archaic practices meant to help and cure just made matters worse for people. But in a wider sense, are they spooky because they involve disability? Is saying those things are spooky acknowledging that those are sacred spaces, like a graveyard, that maybe should be more respected? Is it acknowledging the harm done to people in these places? What does it mean that we can both consciously or unconsciously acknowledge a narrative that the ones doing the pathologizing are the problem while simultaneously pathologizing those characters ourselves? I read this one article specifically about the idea of the empty or abandoned wheelchair as a visual cue, often for the paranormal, but also as a sort of Chekhov's gun for future impairment. The empty wheelchair becomes a convenient embodiment of an immaterial presence by serving as a supernatural connection between life and death and visually enticing to viewers to feel that they themselves might also be threatened. It specifically talked about how people view disability as being a sort of liminal existence between life and death, and thus a visual cue of impairment is inherently unsettling to people, as well as a place where the paranormal is more likely to reside. And that's something that requires two pieces to function, in this case the person and the chair, and the lack of person is inherently unsettling and requires explanation. And I think that was probably like my favorite of everything that I read for this. I didn't realize how often that appears as a trope and what we're so used to reading onto it. I'm rarely caught off guard by tropes these days. I thought that was fun. But all of that being said, disability in horror isn't inherently negative or a problem. At least I don't think that it is. Many of the Gothic texts that then became absolutely butchered when they were adapted to film encourage you to sympathize with the monster. Perhaps there's a bit of an ableist tone to it, but it's usually better than what you would think it would be from all the way back then. In between all of the articles I read about the harm caused by disabled villainy and sainthood, I also read articles by queer people and disabled people talking about how horror was the only way they got to see people like them on screen. And I carry that with a nuance, right, that seeing people like you exclusively as the bad guys who don't get to live a happily ever after and are cast out by society is an issue that can and does very much harm people. But also, if you feel like an outcast and you see another outcast like you on screen, no matter what happens to the character, you do feel a little bit less alone. The social narrative has also slowly been shifting from other is negative to being different is an asset, and so people are consuming these older films differently today than they were back then. Horror is the one genre we consistently appear in, which at the very least means people want us in stories, and audiences want to experience and connect with disability to some extent. It's also kind of revolutionary as a genre. Horror does not simply stage pain for spectacle or thrill. It dramatizes power, amplifies silenced voices, and demands that audiences confront what dominant narratives often suppress. It exists to hold ambiguity and tension and discomfort, and while it can and has used disability as a tool for entertainment and shock value in an exploitative manner historically, it has also pointed out a lot of issues around power and marginalization. There's this idea that horror as a genre is kind of like lowbrow, unimportant, unartistic stuff, but it's such an important space for creativity and storytelling and score writing as well, that literally has to center social commentary because it requires knowing what the world is terrified of and how to push those specific buttons, both to confront what's scary to us and also to confront why that's scary to us. The most recent literature on disability horror that I came across was not saying, hey, here's all the bad stuff the genre has done to disabled in the past, can we just stop doing it? It was saying, hey, why is this the one genre we're mostly in? Can we expand the canon to include other stuff? And also, this genre itself has been horribly uncreative when it comes to telling disabled stories, because there's so much we're missing out on that is way more fun and interesting and includes disableds rather than using us as narrative tools. Now, I will note that disabled people have been involved in horror film from the beginning. Again, Todd Browning was a disabled person. He was a former circus and vaudeville performer who had a shattered right leg after a 1915 car accident. We've also already talked about, of course, one of the most famous horror actors of all time, Lon Chaney, as a child of deaf adults. John Barrymore, who played Jekyll and Hyde in the 1920 film, was briefly institutionalized after his time in the role due to nervous collapse. And there were many times when, to play a character, actors had to do things to fake impairment and disability that to some degree did impair them. And I don't think that that means, oh, this person who struggled with this aspect of performing disability is therefore disabled, so it's fine they played the role. But it does very much like blur this line between what performers are and aren't disabled because of how fluid that category actually is. Many of those involved in constructing horror films' disability performances were no strangers to impairment. There's also the 1975 Deafula film, which is Dracula entirely in ASL, and the 2016 Spring Break Zombie Massacre, created by and starring two people with Down syndrome. And of course, disabled people being involved in the construction of a narrative also does not mean the narrative can't still have extensive problems and cause great harm. We've seen this issue recently with the rise of disability consultants on media who don't actually have any scholarly knowledge of the field and just focus on like making a disability look factually realistic on screen, which is not the same thing, but I digress. When it comes to including disability in an interesting way, one big question is how can we make something scary to a disabled person rather than making the disabled person scary? Like, if we look at the idea behind all of the like, oh, if you're a deaf person, you can't hear any of the Monsters Movements movies, we rarely see them actually using any of the support systems that deaf people have in place in their houses so that they can like hear the doorbell without hearing the doorbell. And deaf people are very creative. So what kinds of things could they do to outsmart the monster along the way that hearing filmmakers don't even think about as possibilities but are everyday normalities for deaf folks? Or with something else. I read a great article called Psychological Horror, Neurotypical Literary Adventures in Neurodivergent Banalities that talked about how sometimes the thing that's meant to be subversive and scary in a piece of media is just like a regular neurodivergent or otherwise disabled experience, like hypersensitivity or lack of physical control or thought perseveration. And so that automatically defines default as to who they expect their audience to be, or who that audience is like meant to be. And for people who don't find that scary because of their lived experience, might be a little more frustrating, if not outright offensive, to sit through that. So then how can we expand beyond that to create something that is more frightening? There are so many things that can be narratively played with about the concept of a typical body mind and with the extent of disabled creativity that the genre just seems to forget about. Which means that there is actually a new direction this genre can go in that hasn't been done before. How fun is that? I'm gonna leave this video here, but please let me know your favorite horror films in the comments or ones you dislike and want to rant about. That is just as welcome. I kind of exclusively watch horror films made before like 1940 and only for research purposes. It's not my vibe, so I don't really have recommendations for you, unfortunately. I did accidentally watch a disability thriller recently that I liked. Oh, I also saw A Different Man. A Different Man involves facial difference. It's really surreal and fun, just like really gory in the middle bit. Do recommend that one. And The Silent Hour is a death thriller where they're stuck in a building with mobsters. That was really well done as well. Sandra May Frank can do no wrong, so that's probably why. I have some morbid curiosity about A Quiet Place and Bird Box because both have such mixed opinions from the scholar side. I kind of want to know where I fall on that, but we'll see. Let me know how scary they are and maybe I'll think about it. But in the meantime, sources are all linked below. Comment section, like button, subscribe button, all of those things are below. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being. Remember, critical thinking is really sexy. I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.